When the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe, it left behind more than empty villages and broken families. It left a continent forced to rebuild itself from the ground up. Fields stood waiting for farmers who never returned. Churches rang with fewer bells, and towns cautiously tried to remember what normal life felt like. But in that slow and uneasy recovery, something unexpected began to happen. Wages rose, traditions shifted, and the seeds of a new world were planted quietly, almost invisibly, across the ruins of the old. Tonight, we'll drift through that long rebuilding, step by step, and see how Europe reshaped itself in the centuries after the plague. Fields without farmers, the empty villages of post-plague Europe. Chapter 1. Silence in the villages. When you close your eyes and imagine Europe in the years just after the Black Death, do not picture the crowded, bustling streets of medieval towns nor the busy workshops of guild craftsmen. Instead, picture silence. Fields where no one came to plow. Villages where church bells no longer rang. Stone cottages with doors left ajar, as if their owners had stepped out and never returned. The Black Death had torn through Europe between 1347 and 1351, taking perhaps a third to half of the population. When the plague finally ebbed, what remained was not a celebration of survival, but an eerie stillness. For you, standing in one of those villages in, say, the year 1353, the world would have felt profoundly altered. The routines of medieval life, so steady, so repetitive, were broken. The wheat fields that once required endless hands to till, weed, and harvest were dotted with weeds. Oxen went unshod because the village blacksmith was gone. The parish priest, who should have been offering mass, lay buried with his flock. Survivors, though relieved to be alive, were left staring at gaps that could not easily be filled, a Europe short of people. The most immediate effect after the plague was demographic. In some places, whole villages were abandoned outright. Chroniclers wrote of deserted hamlets in England, France, and Italy. Archaeological surveys confirm it. Some parishes lost more than 70% of their population, leaving behind only a handful of households. Imagine being one of those few left behind. You would wake in the morning to a landscape where your neighbor's home sat dark and empty, where even the dogs and chickens that once filled the lanes had died or been taken away. The population decline was not evenly spread. In certain towns, the loss might have been a third, while rural hamlets in poorer regions suffered greater. But the overall reality was this: Europe had too much land and not enough people. The consequence was paradoxical. On the one hand, fields went unplowed, harvests shrank, and bread grew scarce. On the other, survivors discovered opportunities. Where once they had been bound tightly to the land, to a lord, or to a fixed wage, now their labor was precious. Wages and work. Before the plague, peasants and laborers had little bargaining power. A lord could always find another hand to work his domain, another plowman to guide the oxen, another maid to scrub the floors. After the plague, the tables turned. Suddenly, landowners could not find enough men to till their acres. Builders could not find enough masons to repair town walls. The demand for labor was high, and the supply had collapsed. This shift became one of the quiet revolutions of post-plague Europe. In England, for instance, laborers began demanding higher wages, and many succeeded in securing them, though governments tried to resist. The famous Ordinance of Laborers, issued in 1349, and later the Statute of Laborers in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Officials insisted that peasants must not take advantage of the crisis. But law on paper is one thing, and reality in the fields is another. Many peasants simply walked away from their old manners, seeking work elsewhere where wages were better or conditions looser. For you, if you had been a farm laborer in the 1350s, this meant choices that your father or grandfather never had. If your lord refused you higher pay, You could vanish, travel to the next town, or even further, and offer your labor to someone else. A mason, a carpenter, or a plowman might now find himself courted by employers. In towns, skilled artisans discovered they could charge more for their work. The church in decline. Another quiet but profound change was in the church. The clergy had been especially hard hit by the plague. Priests, monks, and friars had often remained with the sick when others fled, administering last rites or offering comfort. As a result, mortality among the clergy was catastrophic. In some dioceses, half the priests died. Replacements were hurriedly ordained, often with little training. This left the spiritual authority of the church weakened in practice, even if its institutions remained intact. Imagine being a villager who went to Mass in 1353. The new priest might be a young man barely trained in Latin, fumbling through the liturgy. Where once the parish had been guided by an older, learned rector, now it was shepherded by someone thrust into the role almost overnight. Many people felt that the church had failed them during the plague, that prayers and processions had not prevented death. Though Europe remained deeply Christian, seeds of doubt were planted. Some survivors became more devout, seeking meaning in pilgrimages or new religious orders. Others grew cynical, setting the stage for changes centuries later. Abandoned land and shifting ownership. The sheer amount of abandoned land also reshaped society. Entire manors in England were deserted. Lords who once collected rents from dozens of tenants suddenly found themselves without income. Land changed hands rapidly, sometimes reverting to the crown, sometimes sold off at low prices. For common people, this occasionally meant upward mobility. Families who survived might lease more land than they could have dreamed of before the plague. In Italy, records show merchants buying up empty lots in cities or rural estates abandoned by noble families. In Eastern Europe, some lords tried to tighten their grip, binding peasants more firmly to the land to prevent their escape. In Western Europe, however, mobility increased. The balance of power between lords and peasants shifted in ways that would echo for centuries. Everyday life amidst loss. But beyond these larger forces, wages, land, the church, the daily experience of survivors was shaped most by absence. Picture the small, dull details. A village feast day that now drew only half the crowd. A marketplace with stalls standing empty. A wedding with no fiddler because the musician had died. These small gaps accumulated into a sense of strangeness. Survivors often felt as though they lived among ghosts. Chroniclers mentioned the silence of the countryside, but also the weeds. Abandoned fields quickly sprouted brush. Sheep and deer wandered where crops had once grown. Roads fell into disrepair. Even the ringing of bells, so common in medieval Europe, diminished. With fewer people, there were fewer marriages, fewer baptisms, fewer funerals, though death had once seemed to dominate everything, and still, survivors carried on. They mended what they could, they tilled the fields that were left, and they began the slow work of restoring some kind of rhythm. But always with the awareness that life would not return to the old normal. Something fundamental had shifted, even if no one could yet say what it meant for the future. Unresolved thought. As you stand in that quiet village in 1353, listening to the crows instead of the church bells, you cannot help but wonder, would this new scarcity of people lead to freedom for the survivors? Or would rulers and lords find ways to tighten their grip and restore the old order? Chapter 2. Fields left untouched. Labor, wages, and the quiet struggle of survival. When the plague burned its way through the towns and villages of Europe, it left behind more than death. It left behind silence. Villages that had once echoed with the sound of oxen pulling plows and children fetching water from the well stood strangely still. Fields that had been carefully tilled for generations now grew wild with weeds, thistles, and tangled grasses. You can imagine yourself standing in such a place in the late 1350s, in a hamlet somewhere in England, France, or the Low Countries. You look around and realize that while the land itself remains, the people who once tended it are gone. The Black Death had not simply claimed lives. It had created an emptiness that could not easily be filled. This emptiness was especially felt in the world of work. Before the plague, peasants had always been numerous. They had been cheap, abundant, and easily replaceable labor. The manor lords, monasteries, and wealthy townsfolk who owned land could dictate the terms. Wages were low, obligations were heavy, and mobility was restricted by tradition and law. But after the Black Death, the balance shifted in an almost imperceptible yet powerful way. For the first time in centuries, ordinary men and women who worked with their hands could command higher wages, or in some cases, refuse to work at all. Labor shortages across the continent. Take the countryside of England as an example. Historians estimate that in the immediate decades after the Black Death, up to a third of villages shrank, some disappearing entirely. Land lay uncultivated and harvests were much smaller. Yet the need for food remained constant for the survivors. Lords needed their fields plowed, their flocks watched, and their harvests gathered. Suddenly, the same number of acres that once required dozens of peasants now had to be managed by half that number. What did this mean for the survivors? It meant bargaining power. A plowman could now say, "If you don't pay me better, I'll walk to the next village where they'll offer more." And often, they did. There are records from the later 14th century of workers wandering from manor to manor, seeking the best offer, sometimes abandoning their long-standing feudal ties. The medieval economy, once rigid and predictable, began to wobble. The situation was similar across France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Italy. In Tuscany, where plague mortality was staggering, landlords struggled to persuade peasants to return to the soil. Some landlords abandoned grain farming entirely and turned to sheep and cattle, since livestock required fewer hands. In other places, vineyards and orchards were left unpruned, while forests crept back into once cleared farmland. The ordinances of labor, laws against change. This shift terrified the landowning class. To them, it looked like the entire social order was in danger of collapse. In England, King Edward III and his government responded swiftly in 1349 with the Ordinance of Laborers, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These laws attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for workers to demand more pay. They also criminalized the movement of laborers who left their lords' estates without permission. Imagine being a village laborer in 1351, summoned before the local court. You had asked for an extra penny a day for haymaking, and now you were accused of violating the statute. The irony, of course, was that there were often not enough men to enforce the law, and even fewer to replace you if you refused to work. The threat of punishment existed, but the need for survival often overrode fear of legal consequence. The statutes were only partly effective. Wages did rise, slowly but steadily, despite attempts to restrain them. In some towns, skilled tradesmen, like masons and carpenters, began earning more than double what they had before the plague. This did not happen overnight. It unfolded over decades, but the seeds of change were sown in the plague years. Shifts in daily life and diet. The impact was not just economic, it was personal. For the survivors, life changed in small but meaningful ways. With fewer mouths to feed, food became more plentiful for those left alive. Wheat and meat, once luxuries for many peasants, became more common on their tables. Ale and wine flowed more freely. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains even suggests that the general health of peasants improved in some regions during the later 14th century. Bones show fewer signs of malnutrition, and teeth suggest diets with more protein. You can imagine the paradox. Entire families were lost, but those who remained might live slightly better than before. A boy who once would have gone hungry might now have a bowl of bread and meat stew more often than not. A woman who once lived in a crowded village now found herself with more land to farm, or even a chance to move into abandoned houses, yet survival was not without its quiet burdens. Widows were more numerous, and many children grew up without parents. Fields that could not be managed were left to revert to nature, creating a landscape of half-abandoned settlements surrounded by patches of wilderness. There must have been, for many, a daily reminder that life was not as it had once been. The push and pull of opportunity. The economic changes also bred resentment. Landlords saw their power slipping. Clergy, too, felt the effects, as church tithes dwindled when parishes lost their populations. Some abbeys closed entirely, their monks dead or dispersed. Meanwhile, peasants and laborers quietly tested the boundaries of their new leverage. In some regions, they negotiated shorter working days, better terms of tenancy, or the right to rent land directly instead of serving under traditional feudal obligations. Slowly, very slowly, the structure of medieval society bent toward a different shape. But was this new opportunity stable? Was it permanent? These questions would echo through the second half of the 14th century. In some places, lords fought back fiercely, trying to enforce old feudal dues. In England, this tug of war would eventually culminate in the peasants' revolt of 1381, when men and women across the countryside rose up, demanding freedom from serfdom. The plague had not only killed bodies, it had planted the seeds of rebellion, a world unevenly rebuilt. It is important to remember that the rebuilding of Europe after the Black Death was uneven. In some places, wealth and opportunity spread widely among survivors. In others, crushing poverty persisted. Certain towns recovered quickly due to trade or strategic location, while others dwindled to little more than ruins. Italy, for example, saw both extremes. Florence suffered heavily but managed to recover its textile industry, albeit with labor unrest and frequent strikes. Meanwhile, in rural Tuscany, many small villages never recovered at all. Across Central and Eastern Europe, where serfdom remained more deeply entrenched, peasants had far less freedom to negotiate wages or leave their land. The story of recovery, then, was not a single narrative. It was a patchwork of experiences, shaped by geography, politics, and the choices of both survivors and rulers. Still, across all these places, the echoes of the plague were felt in how work was valued, how people lived, and how society adapted to the new reality of fewer hands and more land. As the 14th century wore on, Europe slowly reshaped itself around this altered balance of labor and land. Villages were rebuilt, laws were contested, and new ways of living emerged from the ruins. Yet beneath it all was the sense that life had changed in ways that could not be undone. And so you might wonder, if the plague altered labor and wages so deeply, how did it affect the way communities thought about life itself, about wealth, charity, and the role of faith in a world where so many had died? Chapter 3. From Ruins to Renewal. The rebuilding of Europe after the Black Death was not quick, nor was it straightforward. It took decades, indeed centuries, for the continent to reach the population levels it had known before the plague. Yet in the quiet rhythms of recovery, in the patient tilling of new fields, in the rebuilding of towns and parishes, the outlines of a different Europe began to take shape. What seemed in the mid-14th century like a continent undone eventually became the soil out of which a new age grew. A long demographic recovery. One of the most striking features of the post-plague centuries was how slowly population numbers rebounded. Historians estimate that it took well into the 16th century before Europe matched the demographic levels of the early 1300s. The plague did not simply sweep through once and leave. It returned in waves, though none as devastating as the first. Outbreaks in the late 14th and 15th centuries repeatedly checked growth, keeping villages cautious and families small. This meant that the new balance of labor and land persisted longer. than anyone might have predicted in 1350. Fields remained relatively abundant and labor remained scarce. The younger generations inherited not only property, but also the expectation of better wages and fewer burdens. It was a slow change, imperceptible from year to year, but across a century, it altered the very foundations of social relations. The rise of new wealth in towns, the absence of so many mouths to feed, meant that survivors could enjoy greater shares of wealth. Merchants, especially in Italy and the Low Countries, found opportunities to expand trade. The wool and cloth industries of England and Flanders grew stronger, supplying markets across the continent. Banking families in Florence, such as the Medici, were able to rise in prominence during this time, their fortunes built on both commerce and clever management of credit. This growing wealth did not erase the memory of plague, but it did redirect energy. Where once surplus wealth might have been locked up in land or in castles, more of it now flowed into trade, art, and civic life. Shifts in architecture and building. The plague had halted construction across Europe. Cathedrals stood unfinished. Guild halls lay abandoned, and city walls crumbled for lack of labor. When building resumed, it often did so in altered styles. In some places, practical needs came first. Hospitals, almshouses, and parish churches were expanded or repaired to care for communities that had been shaken to their core. In others, new artistic tendencies began to show. Italian cities such as Florence, Siena, and Venice witnessed a flourishing of architectural experimentation that would in time become the hallmarks of Renaissance style. The connection is not direct. The Black Death did not cause the Renaissance. Yet the rebuilding process created conditions in which innovation could thrive. Fewer but wealthier patrons, guilds reorganized with looser entry, and a population eager to leave behind the shadows of the past. Art and the memory of death, cultural. Life after the Black Death carried a dual burden: the memory of death and the desire for renewal. On one hand, the imagery of death was everywhere. Murals of the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, spread across Europe, showing skeletons leading kings, bishops, peasants, and merchants alike into the grave. Tomb carvings depicted the decayed body rather than the serene effigy. Sermons returned again and again to the reminder that life was short, unpredictable, and fragile. On the other hand, art also turned toward celebration of life and beauty. Italian painters such as Giotto and later Masaccio began to emphasize realism, depth, and human expression. The experience of loss seems to have sharpened the appetite for vivid depictions of living people. Music, too, shifted with polyphonic styles gaining ground and creating richer harmonies than the plain chants of earlier centuries. Thus, the rebuilding was not only material, but also emotional. Europeans rebuilt their sense of beauty, of art, and of expression, even as they carried the weight of mortality in their cultural memory. Education and knowledge. The death of so many clergy and scholars during the Black Death had initially left. Universities weakened. But in the 5th-10th century, universities regained strength, and the appetite for learning grew. Cities such as Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Salamanca continued their traditions, while new universities were founded in places such as Prague and Heidelberg. Survivors had seen how fragile life could be. Some responded by turning inward, embracing mysticism or personal piety. Others turned outward, seeking to better understand the world. This was the environment in which humanism took root, an intellectual movement that emphasized classical learning, the study of texts in Greek and Latin, and a focus on the capacities of human beings. Again, the plague was not the cause, but it was part of the backdrop. A society forced to rebuild was also a society forced to rethink. The church under strain. The church never fully recovered its unquestioned authority after the Black Death. Too many priests had died. Too many people had seen the church unable to protect them. Though religious devotion remained widespread, a certain undercurrent of skepticism grew. Lay movements, local confraternities, and personal forms of spirituality gained traction. When reformers in later centuries began to question church practices more openly, the long memory of disappointment during the plague years gave their arguments added force. The rebuilding of Europe after the Black Death thus included not only material life and labor, but also the quiet shifting of faith from unquestioned authority to a more personal and diverse practice. Seeds of the Renaissance. By the late 14th, 15th centuries, the rebuilding had set the stage for what we now call the Renaissance. Cities in Italy became centers of commerce, banking, and art. Northern Europe, too, saw new energy in trade and craftsmanship. Printing, invented in the mid-15th century, accelerated the spread of ideas in ways unimaginable a century earlier. It is too simple to say that the Renaissance came from the Black Death, but without the slow rebuilding, without the redistribution of wealth, without the loosening of old structures, the Renaissance might have taken a different shape or perhaps not emerged as strongly as it did. Daily life in a changed world for ordinary people. The rebuilding was less about art and ideas than about steady adjustments. Villages grew back slowly. Families passed down stories of the plague years. Children played in fields that had once been deserted. Farmers sowed and reaped, sometimes prospering with larger plots than before, sometimes struggling against fresh outbreaks of disease. Markets reopened, fairs resumed, and festivals returned, though often with a more somber tone. Bells tolled for plague victims in later waves, reminding communities that the shadow of pestilence was never entirely gone. Yet life pressed forward, stubborn in its persistence. A Europe transformed. By 1500, Europe was not the same continent it had been. In 1300, its population was still smaller, but its economies were more diverse. Feudal obligations were weaker in the West. Towns were more independent, trade more vigorous, and art more ambitious. The rebuilding after the Black Death had not restored the old order. It had created a new one. This was a Europe where peasants had more bargaining power, where merchants held more wealth, and where artists and scholars began to reshape how humanity saw itself. It was a Europe with scars, but also with new foundations. Closing thought. The Black Death had torn apart the fabric of medieval society, but in the slow weaving of the centuries that followed, Europe produced something new. The rebuilding was not dramatic. It was not a single event or a sudden transformation, but rather a long, quiet adjustment. Fields were replanted, workshops reopened, prayers were whispered, and children grew up in a world that was both haunted and hopeful. In time, that slow rebuilding became the prelude to an age of exploration, reformation, and discovery. But for those who lived in the decades after the plague, it was simply life, ordinary, cautious, persistent life restitching itself day by day. Thank you for joining me tonight here on Quiet, Boring Sleep. I hope this gentle walk through history brought you a little peace, and maybe even helped you drift closer to rest. If you enjoyed this calm storytelling, please give the video a like. It helps others find their way here too. And if you'd like more quiet journeys into the past, don't forget to subscribe and be part of our sleepy little corner of history. Until next time, may your night be restful and your dreams be soft.